Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the men's division of Sarah Schneer. If you're exploring the idea of earning a degree but aren't sure where to start, you're not the only one. Maybe you're wondering whether your yeshiva credits will count, how to navigate financial aid, or which program actually leads to a career. That's where the men's division of Sarah Schneer can help. With degree paths in accounting, business, ABA, pre-med, psychology, paralegal, special education, and social work, you'll earn a degree from one of their prestigious partner colleges and be supported all the way through. From expert academic advising to a strong group of peers who learn and grow together, the experience is designed to help you succeed. And when you're ready to take the next step, their advisors are there to guide you, helping you choose the program that fits your goals and walking you through every stage of the process. Applications are open now for the fall semester. Visit their website, www.sarash.com. That's SARASCH.com, or call 917-209-8204 to speak with a helpful advisor today, and you can find this information in the show's notes. This episode is also sponsored by Mosaic Press. Check out their many titles, including The Torah of Tomorrow. Rav Kook wrote in a language most of us aren't used to, layered, poetic, rich with nuance. For many, it feels just out of reach. The Torah of Tomorrow changes that. This book presents a selection of Rav Kook's writings in the original Hebrew with a faithful and accessible English translation alongside. Not paraphrased, not interpreted, translated. Carefully, thoughtfully, and with deep respect for the text. These are not random pieces. They were chosen because they speak directly to the questions people are asking today about faith, identity, struggle, growth, and the future of the Jewish people. The book invites you to engage with Rav Kook on his terms, but with the tools to actually understand him. If you wanted to learn Rav Kook but didn't know where to start, or if you've learned his Svarim before and wanted a clearer, deeper path in, this is the place. Go to mosaicapress.com, use code CHATTER, CHATTER, for 15% off, and you can also find the link and information in the show notes. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the link in the show notes. You can also find links in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, and book deals, as well as the Svarim Chatter status, WhatsApp status, which posts similar type of things, as well as giveaways. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. Morris Faierstein, who is the author of a number of books and translated works. And this time, we'll be discussing his new book titled The Dybbuk, Its Origins and History, published by SUNY Press. And really a fascinating book. It's a study of the Dybbuk and the early Dybbuk stories, as well as the second half of the book is a translation into English of those original stories. And we'll discuss here what a Dybbuk is, what are the earliest sources for it, what's a Gilgul versus a Dybbuk, a Ruach, a Iber, all these other different terminologies that listeners may be familiar with, but before diving into it, not really sure what the difference is between how you define each one individually. So thank you, Dr. Faierstein, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me again.
How did you become interested in Dybbuk? In the past, in a previous episode, we discussed Sefer Chazyonis, Rechaim Vital's autobiography. You've also worked on Yiddish things, and you have a new book also out on Yiddish Bible. You have a variety of different interests.
Yes.
How and why on Dybbuk?
Well, good question. What possessed me to do a book on the Dybbuk?
Yeah, I missed the pun. Look at that.
So I can go back all the way, actually, to more than 50 years. My first encounter with the Dybbuk was in 1970 when I was a young student at the Hebrew University. And I had heard about, I'd read the play, by Ansky, but I'd also heard that there was a movie had been made in 1937 in Warsaw about the play, and I was very interested in seeing that. And that sort of did not have the effect it has on most people. I walked away from it shaking my head. Little things like, as a native speaker of Yiddish, I was shocked that in 1937 in Warsaw, actors were clearly not Yiddish speakers. Only one actor spoke Yiddish like it was his native language. But more importantly, the way the whole thing was presented was very strange, made no sense. But I put that sort of in the back of my mind. I was reminded again about 25 years later, when by a variety of circumstances, I started working on a translation of Chaim Vital's mystical diary called Sefer Chazyonot, or the Book of Visions in English. And I wound up doing actually two editions. First, I translated it into English for a volume called Jewish Mystical Autobiographies. And then after that, I did a new Hebrew edition because the old Hebrew edition had been out of print for many years, impossible to find. So the Ben Tzvi Institute agreed to publish a new edition in Hebrew. So I spent from beginning to end with both editions and various articles sort of coming out of it, almost 10 years with Chaim Vital. And it turns out that the Dybbuk, the first original Dybbuk story, is found in Chaim Vital's autobiography, in the Sefer Chazionot. And it was very interesting to me because in the Sefer Chazionot, the story that becomes the most famous story, which I'll explain in a minute, is mentioned in maybe 2 or 3 sentences. And then there's another story that I discovered later on that was even stranger than that. So let me go back to the first story. The first story in Chaim Vital is a very simple story. He says that somebody came to the Ari, to Isaac Luria, and said that this woman has been possessed by this spirit. The word Dybbuk actually is a later coinage, but I use the word Dybbuk because a Dybbuk is different from a spirit, from a demon, we can get to that. It's a unique thing. It has unique characteristics. So they come to the Luria and tell him, this person has been possessed. We need to help her. Luria looks at them and says, well, I'm rather busy with other things, but I'll send my disciple Chaim Vital. And he explains to Vital exactly what the procedure is, how you get rid of this Dybbuk. And Vital, in his other writings, in his major collection of writings called his 8 Gates, Shvona Sharim, in Shar Ruach HaKodesh, in the chapters on the Holy Spirit, gives a full description of the process that Luria taught. So in the Chezionot, all he says is that he went, and when he came into the room, the Dybbuk, the person being possessed, turned away from him. And Vital had a bit of an ego, so he got very upset, and he goes over to this woman, or the Dybbuk, and slaps her in the face and says, what's the matter with you? Don't you have any respect? I'm a great rabbi. What are you turning your face away? So the Dybbuk says to him, you don't understand. It's not that I don't have respect for you. It's that the Ziv HaShechina, the glow of the Shechina, the divine aura around you is so great that I can't tolerate it. And therefore, that's why I turn my face away. All right, Vital is satisfied with this. And then the whole story ends in one more sentence where Vital says, and then I got rid of the Dybbuk. Poof, that's it. There's also, I discovered another story, which is sort of buried in it, that it would seem that Vital himself was possessed by a Dybbuk, or at least this is my theory. It's not explicit. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, taking bits and pieces, hints from several stories, and putting it all together. And the conclusion I came to, which is rather bizarre, is that Vital himself was possessed by a Dybbuk, and not only that, but that Dybbuk was Jesus of Nazareth. And the reason why I say it's Jesus is 2 things. Vital describes the place where he was attacked by this demonic being, as he called it. In a different book called Shar Gilgulim, where Luria goes around and identifies many of the graves. Anybody who's been to Tzvat or the area around Tzvat, many of the grave sites that you'll see, Rabbi so-and-so is buried here and Rabbi so-and-so is buried there. Some are historically authentic, but many of them were identified by Luria. As he and his disciples wandered around the area, he would say, here's a place where so-and-so is buried. And there's a place where it says that in a certain spot where Vital says he was attacked by this demonic figure, Luria said, this is where Jesus is buried. Now, the other thing about a Dybbuk, which is important, is a Dybbuk has to be, and we can explain later on how this comes to being, a Dybbuk is a very special thing. It is a Jewish man, cannot be a non-Jew, cannot be a woman, who has been punished, is being punished by being forced, the soul is being forced to wander the earth. So in that sense, Jesus was a Jew, and if he's buried in the spot where Vital was attacked, then I come to the conclusion that it's very possible. And also, This attack was very severe to the point that Luria says in the Sefer Chezionot that he came very close. He was very fearful that he would not be able to save Vital. So who is this incredibly powerful demonic force? So that's how I come to the conclusion that the best answer I can come up with, putting all the facts together, is Jesus.
So let's go back, and that's a good tease here in the beginning, because that's a very interesting discovery and a fascinating story. Maybe we'll get back into it. You mentioned the term Dybbuk, just at the term. Let's even define for the listener the term Dybbuk, and then let's explain what a Dybbuk is, especially as opposed to, you said, is it a demon, a spirit? What is it? It's only a male, not a female. Let's first define the term and where that term Dybbuk comes from, and then what it is. What do we mean when we say Dybbuk?
Very good. Yes, it's very important. As I said, the first occurrence of a Dybbuk is in Tzfat in 1571. And one of the questions we need to consider later on is why there and then. But let's go back to the beginning. The idea of people being possessed by demonic, malevolent forces occurs in every religion and every civilization and every culture. In Judaism, and of course, not only were people possessed, but there are people who are called exorcists, who have special powers, knowledge, who try to take the Dybbuk, the malevolent force, chase it out of the person being affected. The earliest story that I found of a Jewish exorcism by a Jew of a Jew is very interesting. It occurs in Josephus, in his writings. Josephus has a story about a certain exorcist called Eliezer, who is confronted by a person who behaves in a very strange way. In modern terms, we would probably describe this person as somebody who's having epileptic fits. Possession and epilepsy historically go together. People with epileptic fits, people who were what we would call today schizophrenic, who had all kinds of bizarre behavior that could not be understood or explained. One explanation was they're possessed by some demonic evil force. What's interesting about this story with Eliezer is two things. First of all, Josephus tells us that it took place in the presence of the Emperor Vespasian. The other thing that's interesting is the procedure that is described is exactly the same procedure that we will encounter when we talk about later Dybbuk stories in the 17th century. That's the origins. But the Dybbuk concept has a long prehistory, which is very important to understand because, as I said, the definition of a Dybbuk is a Jewish man who has committed so terrible crimes that when he gets to Gehenna, Gehenna will not let him in. He's thrown out of Gehenna, and then he's forced to wander the world eternally until somewhere, somehow, he finds somebody who can do something for him to sort of something Jewishly positive that will then make his soul sufficiently, give it sufficient value that at least he can go back into Gehenna and go through the process of Gehenna. Now, the first story that we encounter is a very famous story, which I believe is sort of the template for this idea.
Do we want to, before you start the story, do I want to jump in? So when someone says Dybbuk, and then they think Dybbuk, Gilgul, Ruach, how do we separate? Before we get to that first story, I'll go back to that. How do we separate those terms? Can you clarify what the technical difference is there?
Technically, a Dybbuk, there is no Dybbuk before 1571. A Dybbuk is, as I said, the soul of a Jewish man who did terrible things that were so terrible that he was not allowed to enter Gehenna, but has to wander the world. And in his wanderings, tries to find some kind of rest, some sort of place where they can find refuge. And this can be anything from an inanimate object to a person. So, for example, in some of the Dybbuk stories, when the Dybbuk is interviewed by the exorcist, they tell stories that they were found refuge inside of stones, inside of animals. Though the most comfortable for a Dybbuk would be a person. And but the Dybbuk has to wait to encounter a person who does something negative so that they are vulnerable. Like, for example, in the first Dybbuk story, the extended one, the woman who's possessed wakes up in the middle of the night and she tries to light a fire with flint and steel, as they did in the 16th century. And she gets very frustrated because she can't light a fire. And she throws it down on the ground and she curses it and says, "Go to the devil." And with that act of saying, "Go to the devil," that gave the Dybbuk the opening to enter her. Or another example, a later Dybbuk story, there's a young man who was possessed by a Dybbuk, and he was wearing tzitzit. And one of them fell off, and it fell into a pile of dung. And the Dybbuk was nearby. So this transgression is a very minor thing. That the string fell off and fell into some dung was enough of a transgression for the Dybbuk to be able to enter the person. And speaking about a young man, let me just mention one very important thing. Contrary to the popular imagination, which all stems from Ansky's play, a Dybbuk does not only possess women, a Dybbuk can possess any person. And in fact, when we add up all the Dybbuk stories, about half the people being possessed are male and half are female. And ages also could be young, old, no distinction. So, the story of Rabbi Akiva and the dead man, as it's normally called. There's one of the minor tractates called Kala Rabati, which is sort of a post-Talmudic tractate. And there's a very famous story in there. The story is as follows. Rabbi Akiva is going down the road, and as he's walking down the road, this person passes him who is carrying a heavy load of wood, and this person looks completely bedraggled, his clothes are torn, his face is blackened, and he's running like he's running for his life. So Rabbi Akiva takes pity on him, runs after him, and says, "Who are you? Who's doing this to you? If you're a slave, I'll redeem you. If how can I help you in your dilemma?" So this person says to him, "You don't understand. I'm dead. I'm a ghost, what we would call a ghost, but it's not a. And I'm being pursued by several avenging angels who are keep beating me if I don't run fast enough. And every night they take this wood that I'm carrying, they build a fire, they burn my body to ashes, and the next morning I'm resurrected, and this process goes on day after day after day, eternally." And so Rebbe Akiva says, "Why are they doing this to you?" So the person says, "Well, I was a terrible person. I murdered, I stealed, I committed every sin under the sun. And when I was killed, my soul went to Gehenna, and when I got to the gates of Gehenna, even the inhabitants of Gehenna rose up and said, 'This is too much. We will not allow this person into Gehenna. I mean, we're bad enough, but this guy is 10 times worse than we are.'" And then what happened, he says, he was put in a sling, like a slingshot. And an angel slung his soul from one end of the earth to the other. And after that, he was forced to wander the earth, pursued by these angels, who are constantly persecuting him and tormenting him. So Rabbi Akiva said, "There must be some way of helping you." So he said, "Well, I overheard one of the angels talking to the other one, and he said that if somebody would do some mitzvah, some positive Jewish deed on his behalf, this would at least give him enough credit, so to speak, to at least get into Gehenna and get out of this cycle." So Rebbe Akiva says, "Well, do you have any family? Do you have any children? Anybody who can help you?" So he says, "Well, when I was killed, my wife was pregnant, but I don't know if she had a son, a daughter, or whatever." So Rebbe Akiva says, "Let me go and find out. Maybe you have a son. Maybe you have children. Who knows?" So he says, "What was your name and what city were you from?" He gives him the information. He goes to the city. And he starts asking around in the city, and people get very angry and upset. What are you asking about this murderer, this rapist, this the worst person ever been in the history of our city? But finally, Rabbi Akiva convinces them to tell him that, yes, his wife did give birth to a son, and the son is now 12, 13 years old, something like that. Rabbi Akiva goes and finds the son, and the son is sort of going in the ways of his father, not completely Jewishly ignorant, not very interested in anything, but Rabbi Akiva perseveres, spends time with him, eventually teaches him enough Hebrew, and convinces him enough to recite a blessing over some food. And the son does it, and the next night, Rabbi Akiva has a dream. This person, this Dybbuk, let's call him, comes to Rabbi Akiva in a dream and profusely thanks him and says, "You've done wonders for me. I am now happily ensconced in Gehenna and getting my punishment like everybody else. And it's all because my son did a mitzvah." Now, the interesting appendix to this story is that this story is also the impetus for a very famous Jewish ritual, which we know as Mourner's Kaddish. Mourner's Kaddish, people don't realize, is a Ashkenazi tradition that was created in the wake of the Crusades. And the first major text that talks about this concept of Mourner's Kaddish is a very famous book called Machzor Vitri. And the Machzor Vitri, where he lays out this idea of Kaddish and the idea that if the son says the Kaddish, somehow this helps the parent in the afterlife. In the course of laying out this idea and this concept, he uses this story that I just told you about Rabbi Akiva and the dead man as the source. So this is one connection. Now, but this still does not bring us to the Dybbuk in Tzvat. There are several other prerequisites or prehistory aspects. Let me digress for a moment. Very interesting thing people don't realize. The Dybbuk is based on the concept of Gilgul, of transmigration of the soul. Not all Jews believe in transmigration. In fact, in the Middle Ages in particular, there were tremendous controversies. Transmigration comes into Judaism in the Middle Ages, in the early medieval Kabbalistic traditions in Spain. The Sefer Bahir, one of the early Kabbalistic texts, is the first text that even mentions the concept of Gilgul, of transmigration. In the Zohar, transmigration is connected to the question of levirate marriage, or as it's called in Hebrew, yibum. In the Torah, it says that if a man dies without having a son, a child, then his brother is required to marry the widow. But there's also, if the widow and the brother don't want to marry, there is a ceremony that you can go through that dissolves the bond. It's called chalitza, and the brother and the widow dissolve their bond, and the widow can go off and marry anybody she wants, and the brother is no longer obligated to marry her. In the Middle Ages, there was a big dispute over this issue. Most rabbis decided halachically that chalitza, the ceremony, is the preferred method of solving this problem rather than yibum, of the brother marrying the widow. However, the Kabbalists in the Zohar felt, because of mystical reasons having to do with transmigrations of souls and such, that yibum was the preferred method. And there's a whole history of disputes from probably the 14th to the 16th century over this issue, where non-Kabbalistic rabbis say, no, chalitza is the method we use, and the Kabbalists say, no, you have to do yibum, because of this notion of Gilgul. Now, the Kabbalists value this concept of yibum so highly that if a man refused to do either yibum or chalitza, the Kabbalists took a very dim view of this idea, and they said that the punishment for a person who refused to do this is Gilgul, in the sense of that his soul will transmigrate, will, but not into another person or another being, but will simply wander the earth as what we have come to know as a Dybbuk. So that's sort of the prehistory. Now, there's one other interesting thing about this. The concept of transmigration is quite ancient. It goes back all the way to Greek philosophy, to a conflict between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle said, no, the soul only exists one time and there is no transmigration. Whereas Plato said there is transmigration. What is interesting, if we look at the later history of Western religion, we'll put Buddhism and Hinduism aside because they are in a different universe. But in Western religion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, what we find is something very interesting. Those parts of these religions that were more influenced by Aristotle, what we call the rational philosophical tradition, are opposed, do not believe in Gilgul, and are opposed to this whole concept that people do, souls transmigrate. Whereas those who are, for example, in medieval Judaism, of course, the Rambam is the most famous example of an Aristotelian. Whereas the Neoplatonists, those influenced by Neoplatonism, which in Judaism usually means the Kabbalists, they're very much involved with the notion of Gilgul, and it's being understood as a concept and accepted. Christianity is very interesting. In Christianity, Western Christianity, meaning both Roman Catholic and later on Protestantism, they are essentially involved or influenced by the Aristotelian tradition, the rationalist tradition. So there is no concept of transmigration in Western Christianity. When you get to Eastern Christianity, to the Orthodox Church, there the traditions are more complicated, and there are some Eastern churches that are Neoplatonic in their orientation, and they will accept the concept of Gilgul. Similarly, in Islam, Sunni Islam is basically Aristotelian, and they don't believe in Gilgul in any sense or form, just like the Christians. But when you get to certain Shiite aspects of the Druze are a very interesting example of that. Druze are very strongly believe in Gilgul, for example, as do some other Shiite offshoots. So it gets, even in other religions related to Judaism in the Western tradition, there are these differing schools of thought. And the key is, are you Neoplatonic or are you Aristotelian, whether you believe in Gilgul or not? So when we get to... So we have this ongoing dispute between the Kabbalists and the non-Kabbalists about Gilgul, and it continues into the 16th, 17th centuries. So this, between the concept of Gilgul and the story of Rabbi Akiva, this is sort of the background, you might say, the prerequisite for the Dybbuk. But we still don't have a Dybbuk actually happening until 1571. The question is why? What is it about Tzvat? That's the $64 question. Why does the Dybbuk appear in Tzvat? Not to mention, there are other things that appear in Tzvat. Magidim, all kinds of interesting phenomena. So here's my theory.
Before I would leave everyone in suspense. Before we get no, we're going to get to that theory. Leave everyone in suspense. Okay. So, practically speaking, where we're holding, before we get to Tzvat, what is the actual difference between Gilgul and Dybbuk? And I'll mention, like Reb Sajigan in Emunah Tzvdeis, as you mentioned, the Aristotelian. Reb Sajigan is very against Gilgul.
Okay, Gilgul is simply transmigration. In other words, Gilgul is not necessarily a negative thing. It can be a positive thing also. It's neutral. Now, what you also have, which I forgot to mention...
So Gilgul is something that happens only before the person is born, someone is born with someone else's soul. As opposed to Dybbuk, you're possessed during your lifetime.
There's a neutral kind of Gilgul and a negative kind. Neutral kind of Gilgul is that sometimes a person can be born with the soul of another person. Let me give you the example of Chaim Vital, because he spends a whole section, the whole chapter of his Sefer Chazionot. Isaac Luria had this unique capability. In fact, there's a whole section in Luria and Kabbalah called Shar Gilgulim, the section on Gilgulim, where Luria tells his disciples different people went through different Gilgulim. So let me take Vital as the example. Luria tells Vital, you are a fourth or fifth Gilgul, I forget the exact number, of a very famous rabbi called Vital de Tolosa, the Maggid Mishnah, one of the major commentaries on Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. And Luria says to him, why did the soul of such a famous rabbi have to reincarnate and come back to earth and live another life? Gilgul is always, you're born with a different with the same soul. It doesn't come to you later in life. So Luria says, Vital de Tolosa was a great rabbi, and the greater the person, even a very, very small sin is magnified. The greater the person, the smaller the sin is magnified. So he said, Vital de Tolosa once made a mistake in a rabbinic decision. Some woman came to him with a question about nida, about menstrual blood and whole question of menstruation. And he gave her the wrong answer. And because of this wrong answer, this was enough of a sin on the part of such an important person that he needs to be reincarnated so that in his next reincarnation, that person who was his next reincarnation would be confronted with a similar issue. And if he got the right answer, that would then absolve the soul and it would no longer have to reincarnate. But apparently different things happened that Luria explains to Vital. And he says to Vital, you're like the fourth incarnation, and you too blew it. And he says to him, you once had a question about blood, and then you gave the wrong answer. So you also blew it. So it meant that probably you'd have to reincarnate another time. Except the problem is, the only person who knew, according to the tradition, who knew to look at a person's forehead and say, you are a reincarnation of so-and-so, and you have been reincarnated because you have to fix this flaw in the character or the sin that your original source committed. But this is a minor infraction. This is simply an opportunity for the original soul to be completely purified and become 100% perfect. A Dybbuk is something else. A Dybbuk is, as I said earlier, a soul that is being punished. Gilgul was not seen as a punishment. It was seen as a form of sort of perfecting the soul in Tzvat. And many other people also were like let me go back to the Kabbalistic interpretation of a rabbinic story, which will explain it also. There is in the Talmud the famous story of the 10 rabbis who were martyred by the Romans. And the way the Kabbalists explained that story was that the 10 rabbis were the reincarnations of Joseph's 10 brothers who sold him into slavery. And their deaths and their martyrdom was the punishment and atonement for the brothers selling Joseph. And that's why there were 10 rabbis. That's an example of the same idea, even retrojected back into history. But there are also other things in Tzvat going on. There are Magidim, there's Ibur, there's a whole category of connections to the other world that do not occur early. So the question is why? What was it about Tzvat? So I have a theory, which I think makes sense. People do not realize that Tzvat, what happens in Tzvat, is one of the great revolutions in Jewish religious life. Probably more innovation was done in Tzvat than had been done since the close of the Talmud. So the question is this: if you're going to do all these religious innovations, new rituals, new traditions, new customs, new halachic interpretations, what is your source of authority? Traditionally, in Judaism, there are two sources of authority: tradition and revelation. Tradition is the normal, as we are familiar with, the notion of rabbinic tradition, the authority passed on from teacher to student to interpret and analyze and understand the halacha, Jewish law and traditions. There's also revelation, meaning you get it from heaven. And this, even though people will normally quote that prophecy ends with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, we know that there were other appeals to heavenly authority. In the Talmud, for example, there's the Bat Kol, there's the revelation of Elijah, other sort of divine intermediaries who bring messages from heaven and who can be relied upon as authorities about what the will of heaven is. For example, one of the traditions about Isaac Luria was that his interpretation of Kabbalah, which was very novel, was based on the fact that Elijah came to him for 6 years and taught him every night. So that's not Isaac Luria who's creating this new interpretation of Kabbalah. It's Elijah bringing down a new interpretation, or he would say the correct interpretation from heaven. And the same way we have other divine intermediaries that pop up in Tzvat. For example, there's a concept in Kabbalah called Ibur Neshama, impregnation of the soul. What does that mean? That's a positive thing. It's in a sense a Dybbuk, but it's not a Dybbuk because it's positive. What it means is that a soul of a famous rabbi will enter the body of another holy person, and they will be able to have dialogue and discussion, and the rabbi coming from heaven is teaching or instructing or informing the famous rabbi who is living at that time. The most famous example of that is Isaac Luria. Example of Luria is what's called, Luria is called Yichud, unification. Unification is a very famous ritual that Luria engaged in regularly that was also seen as a source of his authority. He would go regularly to the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai, the purported author of the Zohar, in Meiron, which is a few miles from Tzfat. He would lie on the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai, and he would have a conversation with him. He would invoke him through various mystical incantations, prayers, whatever you want to call them. And then he would have a conversation with Shimon Bar Yochai, where you could ask him questions, get answers. We have a very interesting example of this. Chaim Vital tells us a very interesting story. He tells us that one day he went with with Luria to the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai, and he describes what he thought. What he saw. What he saw. And what did he see? He sees Luria lying on the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai, and he's talking to somebody, having a conversation with somebody. But all that Vital can hear and see is the Luria. He only hears Luria. He doesn't hear Shimon Bar Yochai. So how does he know that Luria is really talking to Shimon Bar Yochai? Maybe Luria is having a whatever, a hallucination, whatever you want to call it. So the answer to that problem is two things. One of them is the Maggid, and one of them is the Dybbuk. So let me get to the Maggid first.
Maggid, of course, we're referring to the most famously at the time in Sfas is the Beis Yosef's Maggid Meisharim.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yosef Karo. And then there's a second Maggid for a young lady, which is also interesting.
That's to get
the
back
first
to the
one, the most famous one, is Joseph Karo. For my scholarly friends, let me just mention that there was Joseph Teitzak, who was a famous Kabbalist and philosopher in Turkey, who was the teacher of Karo, is also reputed to have had a Maggid, except the consensus is that Teitzak's Maggid was something called automatic writing. which is known in various cultures and traditions, where the mystic sort of puts themselves in a trance-like position, you might say, and their hand starts moving. They start writing, but their hand is not controlled by them, but by this divine messenger within them. But again, this is something that an external person doesn't see or hear. Whereas Karo's Magid was something that was heard. So Karo's Magid, the first time that Karo's Magid enters him is in 1534, 1535, on the first night of Shavuot. Karo and several of his friends, including, among others, Shlomo Alkabetz, the author of Lecha Dodi, they're partaking of a new Kabbalistic ritual. One of the interesting things about the Kabbalists in Sfat that they did is they combed through the Zohar, found all kinds of interesting things in the Zohar, which, as far as we know, nobody ever actually put into practice, and they put it into actual practice. And what I'm talking about is a very famous ritual that everybody today is familiar with, called Tikkun Leil Shavuot. The Zohar says that the Kabbalists, the servants of the Shekhinah, on the night before the great wedding of the Shekhinah, of the masculine and feminine aspects of God, the Shekhinah and Tiferet, which takes place on Shavuot at Sinai. So the servants of the Shekhinah, the Kabbalists, stay up all night, helping her prepare for the wedding, and they do this by adorning her with words of Torah. This is the original, where this ritual originally comes from, is the Zohar, but we have no evidence that anybody ever actually did it until that night in Turkey in 1534-35. In the middle of this ritual, suddenly Karo faints. It looks like he faints, falls down, and suddenly a voice emanates from him. It's not his voice, it's a different voice. And this voice identifies itself as the embodiment of the Mishnah. And this voice has come to teach Karo and to bring him information, enlighten him, teach him, etc., etc. And we know about this because Shlomo Alkabetz was present and writes a letter and describes the whole scene. Now, we know that this Mishnah, which first appeared to him on that night of Shavuot, continued to appear to Karo for the rest of his life. And he kept a diary of all the revelations, all the teachings that he received from the Mishnah. And this was not the only time when people were present who heard the Mishnah speaking through him. And he kept a diary which was later published as a book called Magid Mesharim. And Alkabetz describes the events of that night in a letter which is published in the way this is the way we have it. It's the introduction to the first edition of Magid Mesharim. So here is the first example we have of an embodiment where it's not just that the person receiving the message, so to speak, can hear it or see it, but even those around him they don't see anything, but they hear this voice coming out of Karo, which is clearly not Karo's voice. And apparently it happened many other times throughout his life. So that's a Magid. There's one other story of a Magid, which occurs in Vital's diary, Sefer Chezionot, which is very interesting in many ways, because first of all, the medium, the person who receives the Magid, is not some famous rabbi, not some famous scholar, but a young woman. In fact, we know her father's name, but we don't know her name. In all of Vital's description, he just calls her the daughter of Raphael Anab. Raphael Anab was a well-known person in Damascus. This takes place towards the end of Vital's life, about 10 years before he died. A sage called Piso, Chacham Piso, comes down from heaven because he has an important message from Vital. And it's a very long, convoluted story, which you will find in my Sefer Chezionot in either the English or the Hebrew edition. What's interesting about it is, A, that the young lady is the medium, not one of the rabbis present. The other interesting thing is that Vital himself ignores it. Chacham Piso says, "Go call Vital. I have an important message from him, from his teacher, Isaac Luria." Vital says, "I'm too busy." He ignores it. He's not interested. Eventually he comes, and it plays itself out in very interesting ways. So these are the two famous examples in Tzfat, or in Vital's life, you might say, where a Maggid comes down. There's also, by the way, another Maggid later on in the 18th century, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, also has a Maggid, but that's a different circumstances, different period, but also interesting. But right now we're talking about Tzfat. So the idea of the Maggid is the idea that it shows you that there is a certain amount of, how should I put it, direct revelation still going on. So that the idea that Isaac Luria can go to the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai and talk to him and get messages is not so far-fetched, because people are seeing that people are being possessed by a positive spirit who is bringing positive messages, etc. So my understanding of why the Dybbuk appears in Tzfat is related to this idea. If you, in a sense, the Dybbuk is sort of the negative model. It doesn't come for a positive reason, it comes for a negative reason. But it shows you that a person can be possessed by a spirit, by a soul, and that soul can take possession of the person and control them like the person is a puppet. And in all the stories of Dybbuk possession, person who's being possessed is basically catatonic, is not like in a coma. They're completely unresponsive, and when the Dybbuk is expelled from them, they have no idea what happened. So that's my theory of why you have a Dybbuk in Tzfat and not. So let me take a second, catch my breath, and
yes, definitely. And
I missed something, or
no, I'll add in. I'll let you take a break for a minute here. And so, I mean, really, that's very interesting. You discussed, a Maggid and how that compares to Dybbuk. And we have a Gilgul, we have a Maggid, a Ibur, a Yichud, all these different terms, all these different things moving around. And you explained the differences between them. Obviously, like I said, Gilgul, you have Shar Gilgulim and the Gilgulumar versus a Dybbuk. You mentioned earlier that the anti-Gilgul, I was mentioning before, I know Rav Sadia Goin and Musvadeus is anti-Gilgulim. A lot of the Rishonim are anti, but then you have later Rishonim that are pro it. So you say you have I think that
basically the my sense of it is that's really the whole question starts with the Kabbalists. In other words, the rise of Kabbalah.
Yeah.
You don't have these arguments, these discussions in the time of the Gemara.
Right. So the interesting part here that we should probably discuss more is the exorcism and how that takes place. So now there's a Dybbuk now, and so how do they get rid of the Dybbuk? And there are various different exorcisms that happen, different ways of going about it, mainly the Arizal's way, and then you have Falco, one of his Talmidim, we discussed at length in the book.
Right.
That kind of wasn't done properly. So what's the difference? What are the various ways?
So what's interesting is this. Okay, so in Tzfat, we have two Dybbuk stories. Actually, well, maybe three. But there are two primary ones. The first primary one is the story that I told you about, where Vital talks about that he went to the woman and the Dybbuk turned away, and then he says, and then I exorcised the Dybbuk. There's a much longer version of that story, which appears first appears in 1629 in a book which prints several letters. So we have to move ahead a little bit. In 1602, approximately, there was a rabbi in Moravia, Bohemia, and modern-day Czechoslovakia, called Shlomo Dresnitz. Shlomo Dresnitz was a young man in his 20s who had heard about Isaac Luria and Luria's teachings. They had progressed to the point where people were hearing rumors about them and getting bits and pieces of information. And he was enamored. He was so enamored about Luria and wanting to know more about Luria that he went to the extreme of divorcing his wife, leaving his family, and going by himself to Tzfat to find out what he could about Luria. And he spent the rest of his life in Tzfat, and he married the daughter of one of the latter Kabbalists in Tzfat. And what's important for us is that he had a friend called Yisachar Ber of Kremnitz, who was a very interesting person, a scholar about whom recently a book has been written about it, and he also author of several books on Midrash and Zohar and other things. And Dresnitz writes a series of letters to Yisachar Ber of Kremnitz, describing what he saw and heard in Tzfat. We know altogether of 4 letters that survived. 3 of them were published by Joseph Shlomo Dalmedigo in a book called Talmud Chachma, Basel 1629, where Dalmedigo and his disciple collect all kinds of writings and things that Dalmedigo came across. And among the things that he found, we don't know where or how, are 3 letters that Dresden sent to Yisachar Ber of Kremnitz. At the end of the 3rd letter, there is an appendix, which is a long description of the exorcism that Vital engaged in. They mention sort of in 3 sentences in the Sefer Chezionot. Dresden gives a very long and detailed explanation. Now, the way that Vital exercised the Dybbuk, we have an idea because in the Sha'ar Ruach HaKodesh, one of the other writings, Luria explained to him all the various sort of incantations and divine names and things of that nature that he was to use to force the Dybbuk to leave. And I should mention that all this is in my book, the story, and also the section from the Sha'ar Ruach HaKodesh that describes what Luria told him, but you'll have to go to the original if you want to figure out the exact names, because it's a little hard to transliterate divine names, which usually sort of sound like nonsense syllables. So this was how Luria did it. I'm sorry, Vital did it. Now, what's interesting, as far as we know, this was the only Dybbuk exercised using Luria's method. All the other Dibbukim were exercised by what we'll call the traditional method for the moment. Now, there's one other story that's very strange, which we know very little about. In 1602, in the famous Yiddish Maisa book, story number 157, there is a summarized version of a story of an exorcism of a Dybbuk from a young boy, or a young man, a teenager. The exorcist is supposed to be a fellow called Eliyahu Falco. We know very little about Eliyahu Falco. What we do know about him, he is mentioned in Vital's Sefer Chezionot, and what Vital tells us about him is that Luria, interestingly, had 4 different groups of students, 4 different classes, you might say. And modern scholars have figured out that he probably taught each group of students different things in different ways. Because we have writings from Vital, which was what we normally think of as Luria's teachings, but there are also writings from other students, Ibn Tabul and some others, Moshe Yonah. And what's very interesting, the writings of these students, who claim to be things they heard from Luria, are extremely different than what Vital tells us. It's like as if 2 different worlds. So this is where we get this idea. So Vital tells us that there were four classes and 10 students in each class. He also tells us that Falco was in his class with Luria. But at a certain point, Falco did something that got Luria very upset, and Luria expelled him from his class. But that's as much as we know about Falco and his connection to Luria. Now, what's interesting is that supposedly there are some sources that talk about the idea that Falco sent a letter describing his exorcism in great detail. No original letter survives. We have in the Meisebuch in 1602 an abbreviated version of the story. The complete version of the story is not published until a book appears by Menashe ben Israel in 1651 called Nishmat Chaim. This is the famous Menashe ben Israel, the one who wanted to get the Jews brought back to England, etc. He's a very important person in Amsterdam, etc. Same person. One of his projects, we might say, was the idea of proving the existence of the soul. And this book, Nishmat Chaim, he collected every document, every story he could that shows that the soul exists. Among the documents that he quotes are the story from Dresnitz's letter, and also the first full version of Falco's story about how he exercised Dybbuk. Problem was, we don't know where Menashe ben Israel got the letter. So the Falco thing sort of remains a bit of a mystery. But what is interesting about the Falco letter is that his method of exercising the Dybbuk is exactly the same thing that we found with Josephus. In other words, a standard procedure, shall we call it, which also, by the way, when we looked at the later Dybbuk stories at the end of the 17th century, they are using the Falco procedure, not the Vital procedure. Nobody knows the Vital procedure, except maybe Vital's son, which we might get to. So the standard procedure is that you try to threaten the Dybbuk with magical names, incantations. One very popular thing is to burn either sulfur or some noxious, something that produces noxious smoke, and you stick it under the person's nose. The idea being that you're going to smoke out the Dybbuk with this, foul-smelling thing. There's a root called devil's dung, which smells like dung, I guess, which is why it's called devil's dung. And that was also very popular as a thing that you would light. And when you had gotten the Dybbuk out, sometimes also the idea was that you would try to entice the Dybbuk by saying, if you come out voluntarily, we will pray on your behalf, we will invoke heaven on your behalf, so that you will be able to go into Gehenna, and your wandering will be able to save you from the wandering and get you a passport into Gehenna, so that you can then go through the regular process that has been denied to you. And then the idea is that if you get the Dybbuk out, then you have to hang a bunch of amulets on the person who's being possessed, because these amulets will protect the person against the Dybbuk coming back into them. Because we have evidences sometimes where they say that the exorcism was incomplete or unsuccessful. The Dybbuk came out, but then came back in again for various reasons. Each story is a little different in terms of the details.
That's really essentially the exorcism. And as you mentioned Nishmas Chaim, which I discussed on the podcast a number of episodes about Menashe ben Israel's Nishmas Chaim. So essentially, that's the Meisebuch. We get some of the Falco story. We have the story Meisebuch. We have the story in Nishmas Chaim. How about if we go forward? We jump forward a little bit with Dybbuk story.
Basically, what we have, so if we take the 17th century, the first half of the 17th century, what we have is basically no actual incidents of Dibbukim. We have basically reports, elaborations, etc., about the stories in Tzvat. When we get to the second half of the 17th century, there are a handful of Dybbuk stories. One of the more unusual ones is Shmuel Vital, who is the son of Chaim Vital, the youngest son. Chaim Vital dies in 1620, but his son Shmuel is still alive in the 1660s, probably second marriage, etc. And he tells a story that he was once called to somebody's house, and because they thought their daughter was possessed by a Dybbuk. And it's very interesting. The interesting twist in this story is that when he gets to the house, he discovers that the daughter is not possessed only by a Dybbuk, but by a Muslim jinn, a Muslim demon. So when he comes to the daughter and starts to talk to her, she reaches out and kicks him rather violently. So he gets very upset and he leaves. And then the father of the girl convinces him to come back. And when he comes back, the Dybbuk comes out and says, "You don't understand. It wasn't me that did it. It was a Muslim demon, a jinn, who sort of overpowered me." And what's interesting is what happens then. So Vital says to the father, if she's got a Muslim jinn in her, then you have to go to a Muslim Qadi, to a Muslim holy man, who knows how to capture jinn and exorcise them. And then once he's done that, then I will come back and take care of the Jewish Dybbuk. And that's what happens. He sends for the Qadi gets rid of the Muslim jinn, and then the Jewish Dybbuk says, that now that he's no longer being oppressed by the Muslim demon, he says that he's very docile. In fact, he wants Shmuel Vital to exorcise him and to get him into Gehenna and get him out of this evil life of being a Dybbuk and send him on his way to redemption. And then Vital writes that he did it, and he says he used his father's method, and that story takes place in Damascus. There are then two further stories in Central Europe, which are first-hand accounts. One of them, let me deal with the one of them, I believe, may be a parody. There's a pamphlet that was published in Prague. We don't know exactly when. There's a whole industry of publishing pamphlets in Yiddish, particularly for sort of, I guess, a 17th century equivalent of sort of cheap popular novels. They were like, maybe the standard one was about 20 pages on cheap paper, poorly printed, without any identification of who the printer was, who the author was, just printed and distributed and probably sold for pennies. The best guess we have is it was printed in Prague at the end of the 17th century. It's just based on the paper, the print. These are sort of technical things that experts deal with. This story is called the Ruach, or the Dybbuk in Chorus. It was found in one copy in the Bodleian Library, where there's a large collection of these things, and was discovered in the 1980s by the late Sarah Svatman, who was a very interesting scholar of Yiddish literature. It was written in Yiddish. She was exploring early Yiddish narrative prose and found it and published it. When I read it, and it's also translated in my book, when I read it, there are certain aspects of it that were very unusual, very different from what you find in the normal Dybbuk stories. I have my suspicions about it. And I think it may have been written not as an actual report of a real Dybbuk story, but as a parody of a Dybbuk story. 3 examples why I say that. Number 1, the name of the town where they came from, the name of the exorcist. The name of the town they supposedly came from was called Kotelnia. In early modern Yiddish and early modern German, Kot, K-O-T, means excrement. And the exorcist is Rabbi Baruch Kot, okay, who finally exorcised her. So it sounds very strange. Also, the behavior of the young woman who's being possessed. Normally, as I mentioned, a person possessed is completely catatonic, in a coma. They have no idea what's going on. In this story, the young lady gets up, she dances, she jumps around, she starts singing. On Saturday night, she starts singing certain songs that are normally sung on Saturday night, all kinds of odd things. Let me throw out one other odd thing. The parents take her from town to town, from rabbi to rabbi, to find some rabbi who's able to exorcise this thing. One of the rabbis they go to, who is unsuccessful like most of the others before they get to Rabbi Baruch Kot, is called the Rabbi of Mirapol. Now, why is that interesting? If you're familiar with Ansky's play, what is the name of the rabbi who's at the center of the exorcism in Ansky's play? The Rabbi of Mirapol. Did Ansky read this Yiddish play? I don't know. We're thinking about. Anyway, so this is sort of a very questionable thing. It might be a parody and just very odd. But there is a very famous story that is very well documented that I think, to me, is the last major Dybbuk story that I consider historically authentic in the terms of we have firsthand accounts, we know who the exorcist was, we have other significant historical figures who were involved. And this is a story of the exorcism of a young man from the city of Nikolsburg. And among the people who are mentioned, the exorcist who finally succeeds in exorcising him is a rabbi called Moshe Prager. Moshe Prager is a well-known historical person. He was a significant rabbi. He was author of several books. And also might be relevant the fact that he was also a secret Sabbatian. And one other interesting sort of character on the sidelines is Rabbi David Oppenheim, very famous rabbi and book collector. Oppenheim was a rabbi in the area, Nikolsburg, before he was the rabbi of Prague for many years. And in the story, Oppenheim comes to Moshe Prager and says to him, listen, I'm not an exorcist. I don't know about this Kabbalistic stuff, but I do have a book of sort of Kabbalistic, rituals and recipes and information, which might be of help to you. And he gives him this book as a resource. So this story, and then there is two versions of the story. There's a Hebrew version that Moshe Prager writes in like 4 or 5 pages. It tells the story of this exorcism in one of his Hebrew books that he published in his lifetime, shortly after the events that transpired. And then there is a much longer, more popular Yiddish version that was published a year after the events were supposed to have transpired. But again, within the time, within the framework of the events, so that clearly the person who wrote this Yiddish version writes as if he was present when the events transpired. So at least it's authentic in the sense that it's a document from real people in a real place at a real time that we can document. It's not just in Never Neverland, Now, let me just briefly end what happens after that. In the 18th century, what happens is that basically this story in 1695 is the last Dybbuk story that I could find that I can document. But we also have 2 very interesting Dybbuk stories that are relevant in the 18th century with the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidus. In these 2 stories, 2 very different stories with 2 very different outcomes. Shifrei HaBesht, which is the hagiographical biography of the Baal Shem Tov, is a book written in 2 parts. Part 1 is the biography of the Baal Shem Tov before he becomes famous, when he's still secret, when he's still hidden as a great mystic and Baal Shem. The second part is after his revelation and stories about what he did as a Baal Shem and etc. The first half is very interesting in that it mirrors almost incident for incident the hagiographical biography of Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria was an orphan. The Baal Shem Tov was an orphan. Luria found this mysterious manuscript that he studied. The Baal Shem Tov found this mysterious manuscript. Luria had Elijah come to. Luria lived in a hut where he isolated himself from the rest of the world except for Shabbat. The Baal Shem Tov lived in a hut in the woods as opposed to the Nile. Elijah came to Luria, and I really love this one. Who came to the Baal Shem Tov? Achia Shiloni, a very obscure prophet. Now, what's interesting about Achia Shiloni? He was the teacher of Elijah. Now, and lastly, Elijah comes to Luria at the age of 36 and says the time has come for you to go to Tzfat, to teach, to become a public figure. And Luria does, and then sadly dies at the age of 38. When does the Baal Shem Tov become a public figure, and how does he become a public figure? So the story of how the Baal Shem Tov becomes a public figure involves a Dybbuk. Gershon of Kuti, who was a famous rabbi and the Baal Shem Tov's brother-in-law, but who didn't realize the Baal Shem Tov's greatness, comes to him one day and says, somebody's been possessed by a Dybbuk in town, and I want you to come with me. You'll get a little piety by watching this Dybbuk being exercised. So he goes along. As soon as the Baal Shem Tov walks into the room, the Dybbuk turns to him and says, I know who you are. You can't fool me. You can fool these other people. But you can't do anything to me because you're not allowed to reveal yourself till you're the age of 36. And you're not 36 yet. So the Baal Shem Tov runs away and hides. That night he has a dream. And in his dream, he's told, tomorrow's your 36th birthday. Comes back, exercises the Dybbuk, and everybody says, aha, the Baal Shem Tov has been revealed. That's the first Dybbuk story. The second Dybbuk story, which takes place 10 or 20 years later, they come to the Baal Shem Tov, and they say to him, we have somebody in town who's possessed by a Dybbuk. And the Baal Shem Tov goes and looks at him, and says, what are you guys talking about? He's not possessed by a Dybbuk. He's just crazy. He's got mental illness. And the contrast between the two is very interesting. Now, and that's the last time we hear about Baal Shem Tov and Dibbukim. So what about when we get to Dibbuks, all these Dybbuk stories in the 19th century? And so basically, if you look at them, and let me mention there's a very interesting book by the late scholar Gedalia Nigal. He's a very nice man. But he was a great assembler, but not a great analyst. So his book, he's got every story that's on record. If you look at the stories in the 19th century, you have two things happen. Two categories of stories. One category of stories is of Hasidic rabbis being involved in exorcisms. And these are usually in the hagiographical accounts that were published at the end of the 19th century or even into the 20th century. The problem with these stories is not only that they're not contemporaneous accounts, but they are part of a typical form of hagiography. It's very common in Hasidic hagiographic literature that a lot of Hasidic rebbeim either deliberately or was attributed to them things attributed to the Baal Shem Tov. For example, it was very popular for Hasidic rebbeim to smoke a pipe, a lulka. Why? Because the Baal Shem Tov smoked a lulka. If you're a Hasidic rebbe, then you're supposed to imitate what the Baal Shem Tov did, because he's sort of the role model. So in that way, also similarly with, exercise, the Baal Shem Tov exercised the Dybbuk. So if you're self-respecting tzaddik, your followers say, well, our Rebbe was so great. Among the miracles he performed was exercising a Dybbuk. That's one category. The other category is that the term Dybbuk in the 19th century, particularly in Eastern Europe, became sort of a generic term for where in the past they'd say a shade, a demon, a mazik, an evil spirit, whatever. The generic name for all this became a Dybbuk. So that if you look at a lot of the Dybbuk stories, the fact of the matter is that probably the poor people who they thought had a Dybbuk didn't have a Dybbuk. They probably were either mentally ill in some form, whether it's schizophrenia, multiple personalities, epilepsy, any kind of physical or mental illness that would cause a person to engage in sort of strange and unexplained behavior. So this became popular. It's got a Dybbuk in them. And finally, in the 20th century, there are a number of stories like that. But again, it's all the same thing. There's one famous story. I forget the name of the exorcist. There's one Sephardi exorcist who claimed that he could exercise the Dybbuk, and he did it on television. It's a very famous story. And it was recorded. And then, of course, once they looked at it, they realized that the whole thing was a fraud. It was a publicity stunt. So I'm open to the idea that maybe, I missed something. But as far as I know, the last real Dybbuk was in 1695.
The last documented, I guess, one that you want.
Last documented that we have, that we have evidence that can be relied upon. That,
yes.
Not whether
solid concrete evidence. Not
putting the modern scientific thing on it, but just the idea of what did the people believe, see, hear, etc.
Exactly. So another thing that you did in the book, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that the beginning of the book is an analysis. You go through this.
Right.
And by the way, the book, it's not lengthy, that part of the book.
There aren't that many stories.
I think it's like 75 pages. And then the rest of the book, you obviously have endnotes. So the book is over 200 pages, regular-sized book. But then the other part that you have is actually, with the conclusion, it's a little bit more than 75 pages. It's about
half and half,
pages.
More or less.
Yeah, it's about half and half. And then you have a bunch of appendices, as you call them. Essentially, you take all these stories that we discussed, all these classic stories, completely translate them, annotated.
Right.
So you get all that. So you have the analysis, the story, plus the actual story over there. So you have all of that. And why did you translate? I guess you've done this in the past because you want
to translate. I'm a very big believer in translating. And the reason for this is very simple. First of all, even the texts that are in Hebrew, if you're not a serious rabbinic scholar, you may not be able to understand it. Secondly, these texts have not exist in, obscure places, are hard to find. Some of these texts were published in the 17th century and not republished. So that unless you go to the National Library in Israel or, the British Museum or whatever, you need a major scholarly library to find these texts, the ones that are in Hebrew. And then finally, some of the texts are in Yiddish. And when it comes to early modern Yiddish texts, just because you can read modern Yiddish does not mean you can read old Yiddish. It's, I guess, to use an equivalent in English. Just because you can read modern English does not mean you can read Shakespeare or Chaucer in the original. Plus, the idea is also, of course, as you said, the texts are annotated because, there are scholarly sources, references, ideas that if you're a scholar, fine. But I'm writing not just for scholars, but for trying to also include a broader audience of people who might be interested in the subject, who don't have the technical skills to deal with the sources firsthand.
Yeah, which brings us to the point that I think it's worth mentioning. You mentioned the general public. So right now, as of the time of this recording, the book is hardcover and it's $99. But as you told me before, off air, the hope is that soon it should be available in paperback for much significantly cheaper. So I'll link in the show's notes to the book. When this book comes out, if the paperback's available, it'll be there. If not, it'll just be the hardcover. I was
told by the publisher that their policy is approximately 6 months after the publication of the hardcover, they put it out in paperback, and the paperback will be significantly cheaper. Also, I noticed on Amazon that if you want to get a Kindle edition, the Kindle edition, I think, is about $30. Some people like Kindle. And I believe the paperback, when it comes out, will also be somewhere in that neighborhood of approximately $30 list price. But, every author wants their books to be as cheap as possible, but that's out of our hands. The author, once you submit the manuscript and it's accepted, the decisions, even the decision of how to arrange the book, with the appendixes in the back rather at the end of each chapter, these are all decisions made by the publisher. And, as I can tell you as an author, every author is happy that their book is published. They don't complain too much about, they accept whatever the publisher tells them they have to do.
And listen, you have two other books. You have this book that's published, the Braunspiegel, just published with De Gruyter, a Yiddish translation, and you also have a book coming out about the history of the Yiddish Bible.
Bible, which I'm told is in the process of being printed and probably will be published, hopefully in coming weeks.
So hopefully we'll do a podcast episode on that as well, Amir Hashem. So a number of different things. But thank you again for joining me. I found, reading the book, I told you I read this, so, it was a quick read. I read it on the first day of Shavuos, it didn't even take me the whole day, and it was really interesting to read about the differences. You lay it out very clearly, as you did here on the podcast, the differences in these various terms, terminologies, and then you really say over the documented stories and the differences between the stories. And as you mentioned, you had your theory with Reb Chaim Vital being possessed. You mentioned that earlier in the beginning, so that's pretty interesting to read as well.
I lay out the evidence in the book, and people can, it's like all of it. You can choose it or not, as you wish.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining me once again.
Okay. Thank you for having me.